Hello students, and welcome back to biological anthropology, which is also known as physical anthropology. And today I'm here with my cat Cosmo to tell you about the development of evolutionary theory and to talk a little bit about the power of science to understand and interpret the natural world around us. In this lecture we're going to be talking about a paradigm shift represented or culminating really with Darwin. It's a paradigm shift that changes the way we think about and understand the natural world, and it shapes our understanding of the biological creatures such as humans and our place in the natural world as well. So to get to that paradigm shift, we'll be talking about the history of pre-Darwinian thoughts on evolution, and I'm going to have some different people mentioned in this lecture. So be sure you read about them in your textbook as well and think about their contributions towards our understandings of evolutionary theory today. We'll talk a little bit more about how Darwin was led to make his observations and deductions and his path to finally writing on the origin of species in 1859. And we'll also talk about some examples of natural selection, since what Darwin really described and wrote about was a way through which evolution could occur, and that is natural selection. So we're going to look at that today. Now, first of all, let's start off with this idea of a paradigm shift. And you might not be familiar with this word paradigm, but it's a type of an intellectual framework. It's a way of thinking or understanding about a given set of information. It's sort of a lens through which we can interpret and think about the world. And the paradigm for understanding the natural world for much of the time in the Western world was this idea that the world was fixed and unchanging, that the world is the way it has been since it was created, and nothing new is formed, nothing new is changed or added, but it arrived complete and it is complete. And this is actually not necessarily a Christian invention, this sort of idea. In fact, you can look back to Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, who was a Greek philosopher, and he wrote about his understanding of the natural world in terms of a great chain of being. So what he actually felt was that species, or animals, or organisms, do not change. They are the same. That is the way they are. That's the way they've always been. And so if we are to organize them in sort of a hierarchy, you get something that he would call the great chain of being, with all these organisms and creatures as sort of links on this chain. But they don't move anywhere. They can't mutate or change. And so this is the idea of the immutability of species. Aristotle had these ideas that each living being had a very fixed essence that could not be altered, it could not be changed. And he was trying, again, like I said, to understand this relationship of organisms or living things, and he had the humans at the top of this great chain of beings. So, excuse me. During the Middle Ages, the Christian theologists co-opted this idea. So they basically took over the same sort of way of understanding and thinking about this world, this paradigm. And in fact, this image I share with you here is actually from I believe it's a sketch or a drawing that I'm not sure, that depicts you know what it is? It's probably a block print. Anyway, it depicts a divinely inspired universal hierarchy in which all forms of life are ranked between heaven at the top here and hell at the bottom. So in this image of the world, we all have our place on this great chain of being. You don't move up and down. And whereas Aristotle would have had humans at the top, in the Christian theology you have angels and then God at the very top of this idea. But it continues this idea of this static worldview, the idea that things cannot change, the fixity of species. So there's some sort of, again, an essence that things have an essence of the lemon that makes it a lemon. So a lemon cannot be anything other than a lemon, and that lemon has a particular relationship to the rest of the natural world, its proper place in it. So this idea continued for quite a long time. It really wasn't until the Renaissance in the Western world that we start to see some changes to this way of thought. So the 15th to 16th century, we see this emergence of new ways of understanding and interpreting the natural world, and people become more systematic about how they're studying the natural world, and people start to write and think in a new way, and this paradigm starts to shift. But at the same time, we still have people who are trying to see the world as fixed and unchanging, and the notion of a single creation event to create the world was the common way of thinking. In fact, this is James Ussher. He was an archbishop in Northern Ireland. So an archbishop in the Anglican Church, it's like being up higher in their hierarchy there. And he reinforced that traditional Judeo-Christian idea of creationism, and to do this and to understand the world and its place in it, he decided to calculate how old the earth is. So in order to study and understand nature, he decides he's going to use the methods he has at hand to figure out how old the earth is. So the methodology he used was to look at the generations in the Bible and add them up until you got to modern day. And when he did this, he said the world was created in 4004 BC or BCE. Now this was debated during his lifetime as well, not necessarily the date or that the world was created so recently, but the methodology of how many years count as a generation and which aspects in the Bible you use to determine how many generations have passed, etc. So even though he's coming up with a date using a methodology, it wasn't like this was simply accepted. Today, this is not the methodology that scientists use to determine the origins of the earth. So we have many different ways of understanding and knowing and thinking about the natural world beyond those methods that were available to James Ussher. And a lot of these ideas come out of the studies of the stars, so astronomy, astrophysics, physics, math, geology, geography, environmental studies. All of these different scientific studies give us a better understanding of how old the earth is. So combining multiple methods from multiple studies, today we can come to the understanding that the earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. Now, understanding that the earth is 4.5 billion years old gives us a very different way of looking and thinking about the changes that have occurred on the earth during this period, compared to, the earth being only 6,000 years old, approximately. So as scientists began to revise this age of the earth using multiple methods rather than relying on one single method, we start to see that paradigm shifting and changing as people reflect and re-understand the way the world is. And this is that process of science. Science is a process, not a result. It's a way of thinking about and trying to understand the world by observing and making hypotheses, testing them, repeatedly testing them, and continually finding out new things. The ideas in science, although they seem fixed like facts, are constantly being tweaked and changed as we understand more and more about the world. So science is really a process of learning and exploring. Now, during the Renaissance and during this, the 15th and 16th, but then even on into the 17th and 18th and the 19th centuries, we have a great interest in the natural world. In other words, the animals and the living world and fossils and things we collect. And people began to collect all sorts of types of fossils and catalog birds and animals they would find. This is an image here of the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. It was one of my favorite museums to go to in Vienna because you could walk through these on these wooden floors that sort of creaked, and they had these old cupboards full of all these curious things, stuffed animals, taxidermy from all around the world, and all these old labels from the 1700s and from different emperors who went on a hunt and collected these items. These pictures of the teeth here are supposedly Peter the Great's tooth collection, and he collected these teeth, and so people were curious about and cataloging the natural world, and they're contributing to that knowledge of understanding what's going on in the world. Another naturalist, and again a naturalist during this period was someone who studied the natural world, studied the natural sciences. Today we might consider him more of a biologist, for example, but one naturalist was Carl Linnaeus. He was a Swedish naturalist, and he was also interested in cataloging and finding out and discovering all the different types of certain plants and animals. And what he did, what he's known for, is creating a taxonomy that we still use today. And a taxonomy is simply a way of cataloging or naming living things into these meaningful groups. And his system used binomial nomenclature, the two-name naming system. And we use those binomial nomenclature today when we talk about the scientific names of creatures. So our genus species name is Homo sapiens for humans, genus Homo species sapiens, but we use binomial. We use both of those genus and species names when we're talking about a specific species. And what he did to catalog all these organisms was by look at the categories of similarity that living things share. So he's creating a hierarchy. And what he did was say, let's see what they share in common, and then place them into this sort of category with the largest groupings going with the most organisms that share a certain similarity, and as you narrow it down they get more unique as they go on. So here you can think about I have this going at the bottom here from kingdom to species, going from the most inclusive category into the least inclusive category. And in that case, you think about animals, for example, humans. So we're in the kingdom of animals. Within that kingdom of animals, you look at all those animals and you can divide them up into categories of similarity again. Here in this image, you can think about bears, for example. So we have all these animals here, the grizzly bear, the black bear, the panda, the fox, a squirrel, a snake, and a sea star. We're all animals. But in the next category, in our next phylum, in that next level, we narrow it down again by certain traits. And so then we take out all of those who don't have an enclosed spinal column. And that's the sea star in this case. They do not have an enclosed, that's what chordata means, enclosed spinal cord. So sea stars fall into their own phylum with other animals that are like them, whereas the grizzly bear, black bear, panda, red fox, squirrel, and the snake are still in the same category. And then you can move down again and think about what characteristics these animals have in common that separates some out, to eventually you get to your species. Now, it's interesting because Linnaeus, when he was creating this system, saw species as immutable as well. He did not think that species would change, so he felt he was creating a system that could be used at any point in time to classify what you saw in the natural world. But it's interesting, as we go through the course, you'll see that his system actually lets us think about the evolutionary relationships we share with these other animals. So we are actually more closely related to organisms that are in our smaller category than we are in these larger, more inclusive categories. So we are related to sea stars and foxes and, bears, but we're more related to those mammals than we are to the non-mammals. We're more related to chordata than to the non-chordata. We're more related to animals than we are to plants. Even though we're still related to plants, we're more related to animals. So his classification scheme actually lets us think about how related we are to various animals. It is problematic today because it is a system that it is a snapshot. It's like a picture of the world as it is, and you're trying to place it into this kind of category, which is not very accurate when you think about DNA and when you think about what evolution actually means. And I hope you recall our definition from our first lecture. But we'll come back to this problematic nature of Linnaean categories. Now, around the same time, this 18th century, 17th, 18th century, 19th century, people again are categorizing, they're studying the natural world. People are curious about it, they're writing to each other, books are being published. You have things like a plesiosaur being found by a famous fossil hunter in England, Mary Anning. And it's clear that this plesiosaur was nothing that lived off the coast of England at that time, nor had ever been seen living at this time. And so people began to say, well, how can we understand fossils? How can we understand these fossilized creatures that look nothing like creatures that live in this area today? What does it mean to have an animal that no longer exists? Well, one way of trying to understand and interpreting this, that's following this shift of understanding the world, is an idea that comes from Georges Cuvier, who was a French scientist, a French natural historian, and he's writing about animals and extinct animals, and he comes up with a way to explain why there are fossils found of animals that no longer exist. And he determined that dinosaurs, for example, were wiped out through a catastrophe. And in fact, he said there were a series of revolutions or catastrophes on the earth that wiped out certain animals. So as this catastrophe came, like a big flood, it would kill off certain animals, and we can find their fossils today. But what he said happened next was that other animals from other regions just moved in, and there was nothing new created. There was no evolution. Species did not change. Other animals moved in. So this theory of revolutions, or as we also can call it, catastrophism, was a way of understanding why we have fossils without saying that a species can change. But there are other thinkers at that time arguing that no, this does not seem to be correct. It's not simply that other ones moved in, right? Something else is going on. Why do we have fossils of a horse with 5 toes when today we have a horse with 1 hoof? What's going on? And another thinker, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, comes along with another idea. Again, all part of this paradigm shift, changing the way we understand nature. And he suggests something really important. He says the environment must be playing a role in these species. So he comes up with this idea of the theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And what this idea says is that an animal reacts to changes in the environment, and how it changes or reacts to that environment, it then passes that change on to its offspring. In other words, I can acquire a characteristic in my lifetime, and then my child will inherit it. So if in my environment all of my food is really high up and hard to reach, I'm going to stretch my arms until they get slightly longer. Then I'm going to have a child who will have slightly longer arms. The elephant can stretch its trunk, getting slightly longer, and have an elephant baby with a slightly longer trunk. That baby elephant, if needed, can react to the environment and stretch its trunk and have babies with even longer trunks. And so he says species change, and they change in response to the environment. But his idea does have a flaw. So I want you to think about what his flaw was. Think about it. See if you can answer that question before you continue with the rest of this lecture. Did you come up with an idea yet? Well, I'm not going to tell you the answer quite yet, so I want you to hold on to it. But I want to continue this idea because now we get to Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin was born to a well-off family in rural England. He spent his childhood, playing out in the fields and watching birds, collecting beetles. They didn't have any PlayStations. They didn't have the internet. All he could do all day was collect beetles and do little chemistry experiments and things. But what that meant was he had an intimate relationship with the natural world. He was interested in observing it and trying to understand what was happening in the natural world from a very young age. And of course he was from a wealthy family, which also meant he had tutors and he got to learn things, and he did not have to go to work at a very young age in a factory, which is nice for him. And as he got older, his parents said he should either go into medicine, or theology. And so he tried both of those and went to study. He went to Cambridge. Supposedly at Cambridge he took the same botany class 3 times because he really liked it. He also hung out and did things that college students do, right? He went to the pub, he drank, he hung out with his friends and chatted for hours. Most of that socializing was done with scientists, academics, with other people who were interested in the natural world who didn't have to work. So it was a life of leisure, but it was also a life of intense interaction with very smart people. He also hung out with a taxidermist, who is a person who stuffs dead animals and learned how to be a taxidermist. And even though he wasn't the best student here, he was able to think about the natural world, and converse about it with all these different people. He was also interested in geology, and at one summer, before he's pretty much giving up on his studies, he's going to have to go tell his dad he doesn't want to be a theologian. He already told him he doesn't want to be a doctor, and he knows his dad's not going to be happy. He gets an offer to be the natural historian on an exploratory vessel, a ship that's going around South America to map the coast of South America. And so he goes on this journey, a 4-year journey, right? It's 4 years, I think. 5 years, sorry, 5 years. He goes sailing on this boat, the Beagle, with a few books and just a couple sailors and the captain of the ship to talk to, and lots of time to think and get seasick. And he goes on this incredible journey and observes and thinks about the natural world that he sees, and he collects different specimens on different islands, and this journey really changes his viewpoint and his understanding of the world. One of the things that he was thinking about as he was on his journey was this idea of uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism sounds like a church, but it's not. It is this idea that the same gradual geological processes we observe today also operated in the past. In other words, you look outside, you see it's raining, you can see erosion, right? You saw some dirt washing down the street. You start to think, I wonder how we got our canyons. Probably some river water wore away the dirt over a long period of time. You see a volcano erupting. You experience an earthquake. You start to see that the earth and the way it looks would have been shaped by these processes in the past. And Hutton and Lyell were two geologists who wrote about uniformitarianism. And Darwin actually had Lyell's, I believe it was Lyell's book along on his journey. So, you know, he doesn't have a lot of room on the ship, but this is one of the books he brings along. And he's thinking about this long period of time through which the Earth must be changing, and these processes that are slowly operating, so that he realizes the Earth is much older than it was once thought. And he sees that this makes sense as he studies the coastline of South America and the places he journeys. When he returns, he also keeps in mind another person who was writing during this time, which is Thomas Malthus. And Malthus was, I believe it's actually an economist who was writing. And, excuse me, he wrote about populations. And he was concerned that as populations are growing and growing, we're going to meet a point of crisis where the resources on Earth are outstripped. So if you think about it, the same thing can happen in nature. You have too many mice in a field, they'll deplete the area of resources, and then you'll have a crisis. Malthus had the same idea that this could happen with humans. And in fact, Malthus thought for this reason the British government should simply stop feeding its poor people and don't help them out because there's too many people anyway. So Malthus, not necessarily a nice socially inclined guy, but he has some really interesting ideas. That, you know, there's a lot of people being born, populations are getting larger, and at some point the species can't survive, the entirety of the species can't survive. So Darwin takes this idea, he takes what he's been reading about geology, he takes all the information he's gleaned from his trip and looking at the animals that he's observed and talking to people on the coast of South America and looking at fossils. And he says, let me think and see how I can understand the natural world, a little different. One way he starts thinking about this material is thinking back to his journey along the coast of South America here to the Galapagos Islands. You can see they are off the coast of South America. Now the Galapagos Islands are a set of volcanic islands, so they're fairly new, and they've been settled by many different species. And Darwin collected a number of finches with various bill types from different islands. And he shot them and stuffed them and prepared them and brought them back to the British Museum in London. And there he had a friend of his who was an ornithologist look at them, and together they realized that the finches, although they were all pretty the same type of bird, had different bill shapes, some different characteristics based on which island they lived on, and based on the environment and the plant type on those islands. So what Darwin said then is, there must be a type of adaptive radiation occurring from one founding species that flew over to these volcanic islands. Maybe it got swept over on a storm. They then settled on these islands and adapted to the variations in the environment that they found on each of these islands. So on an island where you had a lot of fruit, you had tree finches with small beaks like this. Where you had, let's see, what else could you have? Cactus eaters, then you had a very different type of beak shape. So over time, from one particular species, something's happening to make these turn into different types. That's adaptive radiation. And he explained it like this. Drawing on Malthus, Darwin observed, populations have the potential to grow rather large, right? We can have lots and lots of children, lots of offspring. The birds can have lots of babies. But if you look at the animal populations, they tend to be rather stable. What is going on? He draws a conclusion then from these two observations. He says there must be some kind of struggle for existence. Not every single individual that's born or has the potential to be born is going to survive. Those that are, something that's going on, those that are, better equipped for the environment perhaps are going to survive, right? This helps them think about the idea that, there's actually lots of variation in nature. We tend to see all the finch birds looking the same, but if you look close at a population of finches or a population of pigeons on the street, they have all slight variations. That's that variation in nature. So that's his third observation. So something about certain variations must work well in a particular environment, and then those variations are going to get passed on in greater frequency to their offspring. In other words, some of those variations are favored, and this is what he writes about, natural selection. This is in Evolution by Natural Selection, and Darwin finally publishes his book in 1859 after he'd been back for a long time from his trip, partly because it took him a long time to feel okay with writing about this. He studied theology. What was the church going to think if he said species can change and I've figured out why it happens and how it happens? Maybe not why, but he figured out how it happens. And he finally published it. In your textbook, read about his competitor, Wallace, who had a similar idea. But because of his class, we don't learn about him near as much. Okay? So here we've got Darwin, and he's writing about natural selection as a way through which evolution occurs. And he's talking about survival of the fittest, except that he's not. He never uses those words. That's not him. A social Darwinist comes up with that idea later. But if you want to think about fitness in terms of Darwin, what he's talking about is reproductive success. Not this. Not Arnold Schwarzenegger. The best fitted bird for that island there with cactuses is not going to be the strongest, most muscular bird. It's going to be the bird who can get the most food and be the healthiest and therefore have the most offspring. It might be the smartest, which doesn't mean they have the most muscles. It might be the one who flies the quickest, which again doesn't necessarily mean they have the most muscles. Or it could be the one that can fight off some predator. So it might be the most muscles. So fitness simply refers to this idea of having reproductive success, having more offspring who can inherit your trait. So for natural selection to occur, in order for that fitness to occur, you've got to have the variation among the individuals. We've got to have, differences in our population. We have to have a way to inherit those differences, and we have to have changes in the environment that we call environmental pressure. So if you think about imagine in our classroom, we have a whole bunch of white fluffy bunnies. And white fluffy bunnies, they reproduce pretty quickly. But if you look around at our white fluffy bunnies, some of them have floppier ears than the other. Some of them have slightly stronger tail legs. Some of them are, more mottled on the fur color. There's variation among them. Sure, they're fluffy white bunnies, but they're slightly different. We also have environmental pressures. So let's say in our classroom, we bring in a predator. We bring in a lion. Do lions eat bunnies? I don't know. We're bringing a lion anyway. And so when you bring a lion in there, you change the environment. Now, certain features of those bunnies are going to be more useful, will help them survive better and have more babies. So let's say it's not the bunnies that are the fastest or the bunnies that are the higher jumpers. Let's say it's the smallest bunnies because they can hide away in our bags or under our desks in our classroom here. So those small bunnies now survive at a greater number. Some of the big fast bunnies survive too and have offspring. Some of those are eaten. Some of the slow bunnies are eaten. Some of the small bunnies are eaten. But in general, being small seems to be an advantage here. So that the smaller bunnies tend to have more offspring. So in the next generation, you have more small bunnies. And in the following generation, you have more small bunnies. So over time, that feature is now more dominant in this population. You've just created evolution through natural selection in our classroom. So again, if you think about our definition of evolution, it's a change in the frequency of a gene or a trait in a population over multiple generations. It's that change in how often you get that trait of small or largeness in that bunny population over time. When we think about a population, what we're talking about is simply a breeding group of organisms of the same kind. And when we think about variations, they come about through mutations, and we're going to get to that in another chapter. But before we do, let me ask you if you figured out what was wrong with Lamarck. The problem with Lamarck's idea was that you cannot simply inherit things you acquire in your lifetime. So if I want to have a child with pink hair, it's not good enough for me to simply dye my hair pink. I'm not going to have an offspring that has pink hair. So Lamarck's theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics had a slight problem to it, even though it had some good ideas about environmental pressure. Now to finish up, I want to show you this image of Darwin's tree of life. So before Darwin published on the origin of species, he's thinking about these ideas, and he starts to recognize that from one founding species, you can get these sort of branching off into all different species. So from one original population, you get changes building up, turning into different populations, and eventually over time different species. That's Darwin's tree of life. This does not mean that through natural selection things get more complex and perfect. You know, the bunny population that we just caused to evolve through natural selection, if their predator suddenly changes to a snake, they get an infestation of snakes in the classroom, being small is not going to really help them. So the perfect bunny is not necessarily the small bunny. It depends on the environment. And natural selection is not the only method through which evolution occurs, or the manner or way it occurs. But we'll talk about the other ones as we go forward. Now, I said previously that I was going to talk about the peppered moth example, but I am going to post a link to a video so you can watch somebody else talking about it rather than me. And I just want to conclude here thinking about Darwin's observations and conclusions. Like I mentioned, he recognized that populations can grow large, but populations are pretty stable. And that caused him to recognize that there's a struggle for existence. He also observed that nature has lots of variation, and that led him to say that the organisms best suited for survival leave the most offspring, natural selection. And he knew that some of this variation is inherited. What he didn't know is that it has a genetic basis. So when we get to the genetic section, you will start to become smarter than Darwin. So natural selection changes the genetic composition of a population, and that's what evolution is. Again, it's that change in the frequency of a gene or a trait in a population over multiple generations. So hold on to that and enjoy reading your textbook and learning some more details about Darwin and natural selection. I'll see you later.